So two of the most broken characters in the game are rerunning next patch. We've got Neuvillette, who I think he has so many different strengths in different aspects of the game that a lot of people argue these days he's more powerful than many supports in the game. And you know, usually we say supports are the strongest characters in the game. And then there's Kazuha, who is that guy. He's the best teammate support in probably more teams than he isn't the best teammate. So it's highly likely that whichever DPSs you do play on your account, they probably want Kazuha. I want to focus this video on Neuvillette. I'm really excited for his rerun personally, and I want to share some knowledge with you guys that I've learned over time about Neuvillette. So firstly, let me try summarize why I think he's basically a complete DPS in almost every way you could ask for, all the different tangible ways you could assess a DPS. So number one, him basically being a one-click DPS or a one-tap DPS if you're on mobile. So it makes him very easy for phone, controller players and PC players. I'm starting off with something I think is quite underrated, just because there's a lot of characters who us PC players use and they have a lot of dank combos, but Neuvillette in comparison, he's just very straightforward to play for basically everyone. Number two is that he's got built-in self-healing and also built-in interruption resist if you have his Constellation 1. And coupled with the fact that he's a HP scaling character, which means usually Hoyo makes their raw damage a bit stronger just to make up for the fact that there's less HP buffs in the game. These factors make him almost a do-it-all character, and he doesn't need to rely too much on other teammates. Number three, I would say he's like the only character with horizontal AoE. His charge attack beam is very unique, and he basically doesn't need grouping to hit all enemies that you're fighting. And honestly, I don't think the game was balanced for this. He's also a ranged character, so you don't lose damage from having to run next to enemies like you would when positioning melee characters. So overall, Neuvillette has so little downtime, it's crazy. Next point, as I just mentioned before, he does have juiced up multipliers to balance the fact that he's a HP scaling character. As I said, this is due to there being more attack buffers than HP buffers in the game. But what actually happens is that you can fill Neuvillette's teams with buffers anyway, so he doesn't actually end up being that restrictive in practice. Another point is that he is just overall strong in both AoE and single target, and this is pretty relevant over time because, as you know, a lot of characters have built-in flaws that usually make them better in one area than another, and whilst there definitely is characters and teams that can excel in both, Neuvillette is also one of these characters who I think excels in both. This one I think is very useful for all players, is that Neuvillette has very high synergy with some of the most popular supports in the game, and as I mentioned earlier, since he isn't an attack scaling DPS, he is supposed to be limited with supports, but actually he still ends up synergizing great with Kazuha, with Furina, Zhongli, with Xiangling if you use her for pyro application, with Baiju, with Shinobu, Jean, Charlotte, and he even manages to turn your child into a support too. In fact, just on his synergy with Furina, Neuvillette's built-in healing, which by the way gets boosted by Furina's healing bonus, it makes Neuvillette teams one of the rare teams where you don't really need dedicated healers in their teams when you play Neuvillette Furina. Another point is that Neuvillette isn't too burst reliant, and whilst his burst is needed eventually in order to give him more charge attacks, you can quite easily start and finish fights just using his skill. And I think this might be a bigger deal than some people think. As you know from navigating the overworld and domains, there's nothing more annoying than characters who do no damage unless you have their burst. And this is something that can also carry over into the Abyss, where characters who do rely on their bursts, you often have to waste burst at the end of your Abyss chambers, and it can lead to you having no energy in the next chamber. Another very useful thing is Neuvillette is one of the characters where you can easily swap off him in between your attacks, and I think this is also just as big as not being burst reliant. As you can see in this gameplay, I can defeat 2 enemies with the charge attack, and then I switch off, regroup and buff with Kazuha, and then I can defeat these next 2 enemies. And doing this without having downtime is actually such a big deal in practice. I think it makes his gameplay very flexible, and this is useful for both casual play and speedrunners. Like, for example, if you think about Cyno, you need to cast Cyno's burst in order for him to do damage, but his burst expires if you switch him out, which I don't think is very fun. And in AoE content, you can often run into issues with your supports. Another point, Neuvillette scales very well with primogem investment. He has a very strong weapon, as we've seen in calcs, and he has very strong constellations, all the way from C1 to C6. Something else that I think is very helpful is that his artifact set, Marechaussee Hunter, can be farmed in a very popular domain. You've got Golden Troop here as well, and a lot of DPSs can use Marechaussee Hunter. So this means that you can min-max your Neuvillette builds, whilst also at the same time building for many other characters in your roster too, especially like Furina, who would be in his team as well. And lastly, for speedrunning, honestly, Neuvillette teams kind of require like the least RNG out of any teams to play, and there isn't too much skill gaps in terms of execution either. So if you're a speedrunner who is interested in stress-free video uploads, then I would say Neuvillette is your guy. The only real RNG would be if you're using a weapon like the widsith, or there could be RNG if you're playing without a shield and you don't want to get hit. But many other teams have that issue and they have much more RNG on top of that. Neuvillette's team setups are not difficult to get right, and there's not a ton of skill in doing his charge attack combos either. All you need to know is how to do his charge attack cancel speed up, and just make sure you're positioning yourself correctly. And the last point in regards to speedrunning is that you can optimize your Neuvillette team for basically any cost bracket. Like, no matter if you're a low budget player, mid budget or high budget, there's basically always a way for your Neuvillette to put together a strong build and get a decent run. So overall, I was kind of glazing him hard there, but honestly a lot of that is pretty true. Neuvillette just ticks so many boxes that people look for in a DPS, and even if you might have soft spots for other DPSs, like I'm sure we all do, it's fair to acknowledge that most other DPSs have a lot more flaws and they don't tick quite as many boxes as he does. I think the only real weaknesses Neuvillette has is that obviously Hydra enemies can be immune to his damage, but every elemental DPS has that issue too. And number two, honestly, it's just that some people just find him too boring to play and they find him too boring to commit to long term. And that one, honestly, it can be a very valid point. So how prepared is your account for Neuvillette, and who are some of Neuvillette's best teammates? So if someone held me to gunpoint and forced me to make a list, I'd probably do it something like this: Kazuha as his most important teammate, then Furina, and so on. So I did think this in my first review of Neuvillette, and I still think it holds true today, is that Kazuha is basically his best teammate in all situations, whether you're doing some sort of mono hydro team or some sort of vaporize team or electrocharge team. Neuvillette being a HP scaler, so he doesn't have too many ways to get buffed, but Kazuha provides a ton of buffs with his skill. He also has the VV set for debuffs. You could even have a weapon like Freedom Sworn for more damage increase. And with Kazuha's grouping, he gives a Hydro Swirl to give Neuvillette a Draconic stack. Basically everything you could ever want in a teammate. The problem is obviously if you're a new player, that both of these characters are on banners this patch, and if you could only choose one, which should you pull for? Whilst if I had to, I probably would say Kazuha is the strongest character in the game, or at least the strongest 5-star, but also I don't think you can really compare them, and I've been very consistent with this. With DPSs, you get them because you want to play them, you pull for your favorites, and you shouldn't ever be forced to play a random DPS you don't even like. Whereas supports, they can be your favorites, but generally you get supports to support your DPS you like and make their teams stronger. So that's why you can't really compare them. If Neuvillette is the DPS you want to play on field, then it doesn't make sense to skip him for Kazuha. But that's just the worst case scenario. Hopefully you already have one of these characters, or maybe you can just get lucky and get them both in like 20 pulls. Now, putting Furina below Kazuha, some people might agree, some people might disagree, but honestly with a C0 Neuvillette, C0 Furina, yeah, I think over time both casual players, like you can see in many discussions like this, talking about how they enjoy using Tartaglia, and huge discussions how people feel like their Furina on their C0 Neuvillette teams isn't really being a buff, as well as hardcore players who time their clear times. They're realizing that Furina isn't always the fastest teammate, Now, of course, Furina is still going to be the most popular option, and she's still one of Neuvillette's most popular teammates, but I definitely wouldn't say you need her, especially like I said, if you don't have constellations. So how much buffs does Neuvillette get from Furina? So if nothing else, then she's still a solid sub DPS who will benefit from the same team buffs that Neuvillette does, on top of her having 100% uptime on her damage, them both generating energy for each other, and Furina making your setups a lot more simple and straightforward compared to some of the more complex Neuvillette teams. But what about the fanfare from her burst? Well, unfortunately it's not that simple or precise, since it depends on the amount of HP your team has and what you do. Just to recap, Furina's fanfare is a ramp up buff. It works based on percent, and each percent of HP gained or lost gives 1 fanfare point, and at level 10 4 fanfare points equals 1% damage buff. So Neuvillette full healing himself at the start of a charge attack and then gradually draining back to half HP is roughly more or less about 100% of his HP gained and lost. So 100 fanfare, so about 25% damage bonus, and if he overheals with that, he'll trigger Furina's team-wide healing, which will give a bit of extra juice to the rest of your party. But I think what a lot of players overlook is that, say example, if you're playing a healer, then you don't actually gain extra buffs from your healing if your team has nothing to heal. And this means at the start of the Abyss, when your team is fresh, the buffs will be lower than later on when your healer has a lot to heal. We worked on some visualizations for this, and you can see how you get fanfare over time. And here in a healerless team, at the start of your 3rd charge attack, you'll reach the maximum fanfare, but this is if everyone starts at 100% HP, because you can see Furina is constantly draining the rest of the team's HP, and Neuvillette is easily able to overcap, which activates Furina's extra healing, so it's pretty manageable. Whereas if the whole team starts at half health, you're purely relying on Neuvillette to generate the fanfare, so it takes quite a while longer. And as you can see, Neuvillette isn't even guaranteed to overheal at this point, because if there wasn't fanfare built up during the setup, he won't actually have extra healing bonus in order to boost his own healing. So yeah, in the teams with healers like with Baiju or Charlotte, then your damage will actually be lower in the beginning, but then it will ramp up over time. Whereas if you're using a no healer team like with Zhongli, then it's actually the opposite. You'll have higher buffs in earlier chambers when your team has full HP, and then later when your team's coping and a lot of them are at half HP, then the damage will be lower. But Zhongli gives big buffs with his artifact set, and he of course has his resistance shred. That means using Zhongli in this team can actually be straight up more damage during this period. You have to remember that the archaic petra buffs and Zhongli resistance shred is a lot of buffs, and it isn't really that much different compared to optimizing Furina's own buffs, and Zhongli's buffs are instant. You don't have to wait for them to ramp up. Then yeah, after that I'll put the defensive supports like Zhongli, Baiju, and then after that other defensive supports like Charlotte, Shinobu, Jean, the other Jean, the other Jean, and then some other offensive supports like xiangling, childe, fischl. Don't take this as gospel, this is just what I quickly did. But yeah, I think this is pretty reasonable, but feel free to let me know if you agree or you disagree. So let's get into weapons, and I did do weapon calcs when Neuvillette first released. I did these calcs, but I think they're a bit outdated now, and I'm not even sure where to begin updating them, mainly because there's actually a lot of factors that I've realized over time with each weapon that makes the numbers not tell the full story. First of all, prototype Amber. This is the free-to-play craftable weapon, and this is probably what many players are using. Now actually, if you're playing a Neuvillette Furina team without a healer, then prototype Amber is not just about its damage as I showed here, but since Furina came out, you actually benefit from this team-wide healing, and this can help both maintain Furina's skill damage, and it can help with Furina's fanfare points, meaning in Furina teams, prototype Amber is giving a boost to your overall team damage. But does Furina teams make prototype Amber the best weapon? No, but it definitely gets a bit better. Next weapon we can talk about is the battle pass weapon, sacrificial jade. And again, the numbers here don't tell the full story. There's actually a lot of asterisks with this weapon. I realized the first one being a good thing is that if you're playing a Neuvillette vape team, maybe something like this or something like this, whichever one, Then this elemental mastery here actually gets used, and this can make the numbers higher. It's nothing crazy, but especially if you get refined 5, this is just 3 damage here. Number 2 is that I actually think it's very hard to optimize with this weapon in practice. You get so much crit rate and HP, and also remember that you're getting a lot of crit rate from his artifact set. So add 36 from this, and it can mean you're actually easily able to overcap on crit rate. And also this huge chunk of HP here, it means you end up getting less value from a lot of HP substats like this than if you used other weapons. You have to remember when it comes to weapon calcs is that we always assume all weapons have equal amounts of artifact substats, but you can shift the substats around as you like. But in practice, some weapons are easier to optimize than others, unless you have very ideal artifacts for this weapon, maybe ridiculous pieces like this. It means the average player will probably get worse results comparatively than the percentages you see over here. And the last asterisk for sacrificial jade, this might not be a big deal for you as it is for me, but Neuvillette has to be off field in order to stack this passive. It means you can't start with him in your first team slot if you're on the first side of the abyss. So for example, for me, it means I have to start with Childe in this team. And it means it's not only annoying that you have to wait 5 seconds each time you reset a chamber, but it also means you lose time having to switch to Neuvillette. Then there's also widsith, which I didn't actually cover in my initial weapon calcs. But if you're playing Neuvillette in a vaporize team and you get either this elemental damage buff or this elemental mastery buff, then this can actually get quite close to his signature weapon, which is cool because I didn't even think about it too much before. So 2 out of 3 rolls being beneficial for Neuvillette is pretty good. And if you're playing him in a vaporize team like this, it's going to be a lot stronger than prototype amber. And you see widsith in a lot of speedrunning. Many players get Neuvillette C1 and they just stick with the widsith and they get very impressive runs. Now lastly, for his signature, I think I've mentioned this in previous videos, but this weapon is generally better than it seems in calculations, and that's because I would say it optimizes the best on average, and it also gives Neuvillette some energy. You still might want some ER substats, but not enough where you need to focus on it too much. And what this all means is, with this weapon, you're free to get almost as much crit rate, crit damage, HP percent, energy recharge, EM in vape teams, without fear of having too much of one stat. Technically, you don't want to be getting too much crit damage past 300 or 310 crit damage, but quite obviously that's like a rich person problem. But yeah, it means overall, as you farm better and better artifact pieces, as you get more useful rolls, your builds are more likely to be the most balanced with his signature weapon. Now another topic I know is very popular is people asking, should they get Neuvillette C1 or should they get a signature weapon? Now first of all, it does depend on the weapon you would be upgrading from, since if you're going from prototype amber to the signature, it's a lot higher than if you're going from a battle pass weapon or the widsith to a signature. But yeah, with proto amber, you could easily be looking at over 30% more damage, which can actually be more damage than you'd get going to a C1 in a double hydro team. But yeah, if you're going from sacrificial jade or widsith in a vaporize team to a signature, then the weapon upgrade won't be anywhere near 30%. Depending on your refine, it can be maybe half of that, somewhere in the teens. I think in multiple ways, from a general player, theory crafter, and speedrun perspective, his C1 is a bit stronger than his signature weapon. Not necessarily just on damage, but it's the overall package, especially if you're playing in a double hydro team. This basically opens up his flexibility more. Just a recap from my previous review, this talent is a unique multiplier, going from 125% to 60%. This is a straight up multiplier, meaning 160 divided by 125. It means it's literally 28% more charge attack damage, which is a big deal not having enough reactions, so you're not getting this 160%. And as I covered already, it makes the unfortunate truth that without Constellation 1 or Constellations on Furina, like just C0 Neuvillette, C0 Furina, because of this talent here, it makes Furina just a side grade, since a lot of her buffs and benefits are cancelled out by not getting this full 160%. Unless of course you're getting a random hydro reaction somewhere in your fight. But as I said, that's just the damage part. He also becomes a tank with interruption resistance, which is very nice. A lot of players may feel like without his Constellation 1, they have to run Neuvillette with a shielder like zhongli. So getting this is considered to open flexibility in his teams by letting him get more benefits from double hydro, and you're not needing a shielder. So there's a lot more that goes into this than just looking at the damage increase from the talent. But of course, if you are playing Neuvillette in a solo hydro team with 3 hydro reactions, then you don't get the damage benefit from the C1, so you're just getting the interruption resistance. Still, for me personally, I got his signature weapon first, and I probably will stay at C0R1, even though C1 is somewhat more optimal. Why? If I was to propose this argument for other people, for one, personally I don't always play double hydro, and I enjoy playing solo hydro vape teams like this, so without getting the extra draconic stack, I would technically just get more damage from going to his weapon. Also, bear in mind, a lot of people overlook this, but the damage increase here, this draconic stack, it increases his charge attacks, whereas a weapon upgrade is an increase for everything, including his skill and burst, which you can get big vaporize numbers in those teams. Another reason is I don't buy the battle pass. My only force options are widsith or prototype amber, so his signature allows me to avoid the RNG on the widsith, and it's just a nice damage upgrade. Lastly, as with all weapons, other characters can use this, like for example Mike Lee. Oh yeah, and I do have to say, it is very important what is on both banners. Like, if you don't care about the 4-star characters on his character banner, but the weapon banner has nice weapons, then that could be a deal maker for his weapon, and it could also work vice versa. If the 4 stars are very good for you, then you probably get more benefits going for his C1. Next one, C1 versus getting furina. I know this is another very popular question, and I don't really like comparing characters versus constellations too much, but I do think the answer is quite straightforward, which is strictly Neuvillette team wise, his C1 is stronger as long as you have the skill to play Neuvillette's strongest non-furina teams. However, furina is also a new character who can probably slot into many teams in your account. She also does get stronger if you have Neuvillette C1 or you have constellations on furina, so yeah, it just comes down to whether you want to prioritize your own Neuvillette team or your whole account variety as a whole. Also, if you just want the easiest Neuvillette teams to play, then even at C0, furina could be an upgrade for you, because you might get better results from her teams than with the vaporize teams that are slightly harder. But overall, it's just your choice to make. You can also just save up for both of them. Now let's get into team building. Now there's actually a ton of crossover, whether you're a casual player, mobile, tryhard player, speedrunner, high constellation speedrunner. Here's just a ton of team options. These are just a few ideas. Basically, the goal of most Neuvillette teams is to both add teammates to buff his damage as much as you can, whilst also having enough comfort and utility that you personally need. Number one, can you play double hydro teams at C0? And the answer is absolutely you can. Like playing Childe or Furina, you definitely can. Yes, they might not be as strong without Neuvillette C1, but you still get Hydro Resonance for HP buffs, you get energy particles from your Hydro teammate, so it's easier for your Neuvillette to cycle bursts. You also get good buffs from teammates like Furina, Childe, and Mona. All these Hydros give nice buffs. So double Hydro teams are still viable at C0. Also remember, with extra HP, the more HP you have, the less likely you are to die, so that's always going to be nice. Number two, since I consider Kazuha his best teammate, what do you play if you don't have him? So same thing, even if Kazuha can be the first pick in almost every team, there are still teams where you can use Jean, who can even help with Furina's fanfare stacks. And I've also seen people make Suikos work nicely in like a mono hydro team like this, or even some sort of vaporized team like this. Suikos can work too, so you definitely do have options. So going through some teams in specific, now these first two are quite similar. It's just Neuvillette with his two strongest buffers, Kazuha, Furina, and then a defensive shielder with interrupt resistance like zhongli and some healing with Baiju. The nice thing is that both of these guys add a hydro reaction, so you get a draconic stack. Zhongli giving crystallize and Baiju giving bloom, although the reaction damage you get from bloom is going to be irrelevant here. If you want to know why this team still works with Furina without a healer, then I recommend going back to my previous section on how much Furina buffs Neuvillette, where I try to explain it there. I like Zhongli, and honestly overall this team is probably the easiest and smoothest team to play. Now usually these two teams are his most popular teams you see on YouTube and in usage rate surveys. However, the obvious problem is both of these teams are full of limited 5-star characters who not everyone would have. So actually you can use a 4-star healer like Charlotte or Shinobu and actually get similar results to the other teams. Although with these 4 stars, you're trading the shielding and interruption resistance for more healing focus, but they can definitely get the job done. In fact, I know some players feel like they get the best performance in Neuvillette teams with Charlotte, and she might even have the highest numbers theoretically, but it's honestly just preference. The nice thing is that Charlotte adds freeze and Shinobu adds electro charge, which also help giving Neuvillette a draconic stack. And electro charge in particular can also help your kazuha do a bit more damage. And those of you who liked Shinobu in particular may be interested to know that there is impressive speedruns using Shinobu. Gearing wise, I want to mention that the healers in this team archetype, whether using Baiju, Shinobu, whoever, they can use the new Songs of the Day Past healing set in order to further buff Neuvillette. It's not going to be the biggest increase, but it's definitely what a lot of people are using these days. If you don't have that, you can also use Ocean Hued Clam, which can be similar. But as for zhongli, you should use Archaic Petra if you have it. And if you don't have it, you should consider strong boxing it, since this is a huge buff to Neuvillette and also Furina. For Kazuha, his normal builds are completely fine. Viridescent Venera and a weapon like Xiphos, Favonius Sword, Iron Sting. But I will add 2 important notes, which is that number 1, Kazuha's burst is extremely optional in most Neuvillette teams, and generally it's better not to worry too much about Heal's energy recharge and just try stack as much EM as you can in order to buff Neuvillette. The second one is that if you have Freedom Sworn, this is actually a pretty decent buff for Neuvillette. You won't benefit from this attack buff of course, but you still get 16% charge attack damage, which is okay. Many people also want to know my stance on Furina versus Childe in this slot. I know a lot of people have seen my videos on the speedrun perspective of these 2 characters. I can say though that, as you can see in Reddit posts like this, many people are satisfied using Childe with C1 Neuvillette and they find them completely fine. If you didn't know, Childe's talent here increases Neuvillette's normal attack talent, so putting Childe in your team actually boosts Neuvillette's talent to level 11, which is actually a nice buff, and also you don't even need to switch Childe in order to get that buff. So even for casual play or the overall play, it can actually be quite comforting, effectively only playing a 3-party team and not needing to worry about setting up with another character. But even with that buff, Childe won't be giving the same numerical increases as Furina would, but the damage lost there can be made up by being able to cycle your setups faster and being able to spend more time on Neuvillette. How I like to build Childe is, funny enough, his build doesn't actually matter at all in these teams. You can effectively use him in this role without gear. The only thing you could really do is maybe giving him Favonius Bow and some crit stats so he can generate energy to your team in an emergency if you need it. Since you rarely switch to him in a team like this or a team like this, then you don't actually need to build Childe that much. However, it is a fact that as you get more and more consolations and investment into your Furina team, then she obviously will outscale Childe's benefits. But I think overall the answer to this is, if you already have Childe on your account, he functions perfectly fine as a Furina replacement, and you can consider it that you don't need to be in a rush to get Furina. Now, as I said, you don't need Kazuha. You can use someone like Jean, and Jean's healing will give Furina more fanfare stacks, as well as help keeping Furina's skill damage at its maximum 140%. But just know that compared to doing something like Kazuha Zhongli, for example, using Jean, you're basically lowering Neuvillette's damage whilst raising Furina's damage. Whilst with Kazuha Zhongli, it's the opposite. You're focusing more on Neuvillette's damage and you're lowering Furina's benefits. Now, whilst I would say it's more optimal playing a team like this and focusing more on Neuvillette's raw damage, it's perfectly valid that some people do prefer keeping their team fully healed and utilizing the Furina how she was intended to be played more. So Jean is a perfectly fine option. Also xianyun or sayu too, since they're basically the same thing as Jean in regards to Neuvillette teams. Now if you want to maximize C0 Neuvillette, or if you're able to play him without a shielder, maybe you have C1, then you can do full offense teams with Xiangling, typically as I showed either using zhongli or childe. So the thing with Xiangling is, as we know, one of Neuvillette's weaknesses is not having a ton of teammate buffing options, and Xiangling is kind of a cheat code, since by allowing Neuvillette to vape his attacks, that's basically a form of damage buff, kind of like how Kazuha or Zhongli buffs him. Getting that vaporize multiplier is basically a similar thing. And vaporize also lets your Neuvillette make use of EM stats, which is very nice. This EM roll here is now actually a useful substat. A lot of people do ask me, how do you build Xiangling in these teams? What I do is I use Favonius Lance and an instructor set with as much ER as possible. It's difficult, but try aim for over 220 ER, but you don't need anything like 300 ER or something. Even in a solo pyro team like this, it's not that crazy. Just remember that Xiangling's damage doesn't matter at all here, so all you're worrying about is ER. Also, a lot of people make this mistake, but as you know, when using a 4-star set, you can pick one 5-star artifact off piece. A lot of people in a build like this, they will pick a 5-star Sans for the extra ER you get here, but actually the difference is only about 13 ER. And what I prefer to do is I use a 4-star ER Sans, and then I pick an off-piece 5-star artifact with a ton of ER rolls, and as you can see, I actually get more ER overall doing it this way. You can also use Mona in a team like this. I think it's fair to admit that she is a bit of a weak option compared to Furina or Childe, but she's definitely still usable with her strong burst buff. Some people also like to use fischl, like a team like this, or with Jean. I think this is okay. I actually said this in my first review, but I think some people do overrate fischl's damage outside of Dendro teams with the quicken reaction. Fischl can also overcomplicate your setups, trying to buff both of them. Even with electro charge, you can potentially even mess up your hydro as well, and that can make Neuvillette lose a lot of damage. Like I said before, if I wanted an electro character, I would prefer using Kuki Shinobu. So Shinobu's extra healing I think outweighs fischl's damage in a team like this, honestly, but fischl is still a decent option for sure. And outside of examples like this, honestly, you can use almost anyone. I think that's one of the famous things about Neuvillette. For a lack of better words, he can solo content by himself, and many people just play him in random teams or even just straight up solo with him. Of course, not everyone can do that, but I think it's well known by now that Neuvillette is a very strong solo character. You can even play him in hyperbloom teams, which are not bad, but definitely not that popular. Like maybe if you do something like this, you're basically just playing Neuvillette unbuffed with low damage, and you can definitely just clear with that, but I wouldn't recommend a playstyle like this for most Neuvillette mains personally. You're usually better off just investing into Neuvillette's damage. There's many reasons why, but I can just give one reason why, is that by lowering Neuvillette's damage, it means you're benefiting less from Neuvillette's quality of life. Like his huge range won't matter as much anymore, his low downtime won't matter as much anymore. There's a lot of factors that just make him better in a more hyper carry role. Anyway, that's it for today's video. I hope I answered many of your questions you might have had. You can also look forward to my future videos on Neuvillette, and I'll also be making a Kazuha video ahead of his rerun shortly too. Thanks for watching, guys.